You're listening to the Lead Like No Other Podcast, episode 81. On today's episode, we're going to talk about disruptive behaviors. And in the past couple episodes or posts as well, I've mentioned a recent study that was put out there in regards to disruptive behaviors and a scale that was developed as it relates to healthcare. And although we're going to talk about healthcare-related disruptive behaviors, in my experience over the past decade, I will say that the disruptive behaviors that have been identified as being negatively impactful in a healthcare environment are certainly relevant to other industries as well. And what's important about that is that the same disruptive behaviors that can be experienced in one industry, they can be eradicated by the same methods as well. And that's really what we're going to talk about, is not only what were the disruptive behaviors, but also how do we eliminate these disruptive behaviors from happening within these organizations. Again, I'm Patrick V, and you're listening to the Lead Like No Other podcast, where I'm not only obsessed with interviewing those whose actions are inspiring others to lead like no other, but also in uncovering the research that demonstrates that we all have the ability to lead like no other. And it starts with ourselves. Because when we lead like no other, we succeed like no other. So let's get into it. As I mentioned, the first part of this is to talk about an article that was published in the Joint Commission Journal on Quality and Patient Safety. It was 2020. It was just published in January, and it's volume 46, pages 18 to 26. The title of this is Associations Between a New Disruptive Behavior Scale and Teamwork, Patient Safety, Work-Life Balance, Burnout, and Depression. So the background of this was basically to say disruptive and unprofessional behaviors occur frequently in healthcare and adversely affect patient care and healthcare worker job satisfaction. These behaviors have rarely been evaluated at a work setting level, nor do we fully understand how disruptive behaviors are associated with important metrics such as teamwork and safety climate, work-life balance, burnout, and depression. So the objectives of this study really were to use this survey tool that had been presented to healthcare workers across the U.S. healthcare system, and it was aimed to introduce a brief scale for evaluating disruptive behaviors at a work setting level. And it was looking at investigating associations between disruptive behaviors as well as other validated measures for safety culture and well-being. When we look at the results of this, one or more of the 6 disruptive behaviors that I'll mention was reported in almost 98% of the workplace settings. And disruptive behaviors were reported in similar frequencies by both men and women and by most healthcare worker roles. And disruptive behavior climate was significantly correlated with poorer teamwork climate, safety climate, job satisfaction, and perceptions of management. It also was correlated with lower work-life balance, increased emotional exhaustion, known as burnout, and increased depression. And of all of these, what's important to note here is when we look at a p-value in this study was 0.001 in terms of validity, which is very important. The conclusion of this paper that was printed was that disruptive behaviors are common, measurable, and associated with safety, culture, and healthcare worker well-being. The authors went on to say that this concise disruptive behavior scale affords researchers a new, valid, and actionable tool to assess disruptive behaviors. What's interesting is this study is actually based on work that was done back in 2008, a survey that was done then, where they asked healthcare providers in regards to not only how often had they experienced disruptive behaviors in their workplace setting, but also what impact that had on patient safety. And I think the most concerning one of all that I remember reading of that study was where they asked providers, what impact do you think disruptive behaviors have had as it relates to patient mortality? And 27% of the respondents of that survey suggested that they believed disruptive behaviors had some impact on patient mortality, which to me is mind-blowing. So what were the 6 disruptive behaviors that were identified? Well, the first was listed as when an employee turned their back on another person before that conversation was over. That was the first disruptive behavior. The second disruptive behavior was hanging up the phone before a conversation was over. The third was bullying other people. The fourth was trying to publicly humiliate others. And obviously those are pretty loaded, both bullying and trying to publicly humiliate others. When I think of the public humiliation, I often think of gossiping. That's probably where I've seen this the most, is that what happens is somebody talks about somebody else, spreads a rumor, all to make themselves look better at the other person's expense. The fifth disruptive behavior that was mentioned was around making comments with sexual, racial, religious, or ethnic slurs. And the last one was showing physical aggression. For example, grabbing, throwing, hitting, punching. Obviously, those we see much less frequently, although throwing is probably the one that would be seen the most. When the prevalence of each of these was evaluated by the researchers, what they found was the prevalence for bullying was 31%. The prevalence for turning their back before a conversation was over was 37%. Hanging up the phone on somebody before the conversation was over was 27%. Publicly humiliating somebody else was almost 29%. Making comments with sexual, racist, or ethnic slurs was almost 22%. And showing physical aggression was about 12%. So those are the disruptive behaviors that were identified. Now, when we look at it from a standpoint, again, even though this was related to healthcare, what they looked at was, okay, what's the correlation between disruptive behaviors? And what they found was there was a significant correlation when we looked at those 6 disruptive behaviors around poor teamwork climate, a safety climate, job satisfaction, perceptions of management, lower work-life balance, increased emotional exhaustion or burnout, and increased depression. Now, again, we talk about this from a standpoint of healthcare, but I can tell you certainly from my own experience, when I look at disruptive behaviors, those are ones that I would say that without a study being put in place in those areas, I would say those are the ones that I see very much in line with what's seen in healthcare. And also from a standpoint of what happens to the organizational climate when that happens. And I would say many of those things are still the same. Poor teamwork climate, job satisfaction, perceptions of management, work-life balance, increased emotional exhaustion, certainly burnout happens outside of healthcare, as well as increased depression. How do we address this? Because we see here, right, the evidence continues to mount in regards to what we should probably just expect as common sense. That when we behave in the wrong ways, obviously they have negative impact. And now simply it's about research validating that common sense. There are 2 areas that I think are very impactful when we look at eliminating or reducing disruptive behaviors. On a team, first off, because I think that's where it needs to happen, I'm often reminded of a quote by Einstein where he said, "The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil. It will be destroyed by those who watch evil and do nothing." And I truly believe that is the same with disruptive behaviors within an organization. That unless people work as a team and decide not to stand for that as a group, then there can be 1 or 2 individuals that sort of get to go rogue or run outside of what everybody else wants to see. And I understand that there are conversations that I've had where individuals have said, I'd love to see this go away, but I'm afraid to bring it up to this person because I'm afraid that the target's then going to be put on me. And it's really a feeling of the person feeling like, I've got nobody that's backing me up on this. That it's like going up against the bully, knowing that you're on your own. Nobody else is going to protect you. And that's a difficult place to be. And that's why it's so important for a team to unite. One of the things that I use in a lot of the work that I do is the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Pat Lencioni. As an authorized partner with DISC and Wiley Publications, we do an assessment based on the 5 dysfunctions of a team, but also incorporating personality work into that too. And the benefit that that has is, one is the team gets to identify on levels that were identified in Pat Lencioni's work on the 5 dysfunctions of a team. What level of trust do we have as a team? How do we approach conflict as a team? How do we approach commitment as a team? How do we hold each other accountable as a team? And then how focused are we on effective results as a team as opposed to individually just being concerned with ourselves? And when a team is able to do that, there's an opportunity now to identify what are the problems that are going on within that group. Now, on top of that, what I also use is what I call the Cables Blueprint, and that's based on 6 behaviors that create stronger relationship bridges within a team. And that really is the way that we look at it, is that we can think of this just like the Golden Gate Bridge, that one 3-foot cable is really made up of about 30,000 individually wrapped cables. And when we think about this in terms of behaviors on a team or building stronger relationships on that team, each one of the behaviors in the acronym of cables is representative of a type of behavior that will build a stronger bridge. And part of that is to get rid of things such as disruptive behaviors. So the first one is around congruence and consistency, and having teams or individuals identify how important it is to have consistency on a team. We often hear talk about values. Well, if one of our values is around respect or integrity or collaboration, well, disruptive behaviors really can't happen if we're congruent to the values of collaboration or teamwork. The next one is around appreciation. That's the A in the cables. And that is 2 components. One is about understanding biases, appreciating other people for who they are, and all of the biases that come into play. And we all fall victim to unconscious biases. We would deny many of them, and that's why they're called unconscious biases. But when we understand the negative impact that biases have, we can start to do something about that and build stronger teams. The other part of appreciation with the A in cables is around really accolades. It's about recognizing people for their contributions, building a healthier environment because of that. The B in the model around cables that we talk about is around being for others, but also belongingness. And the being for others component is about my effort to try and provide more benefit than I'm gaining from this relationship or this interaction on this team. The other part of that is around belongingness, and we know the impact that belongingness has, whether it's at school or in the community or at home, that we're pack animals. We need to feel a sense of belongingness. And when we don't have that, our behaviors probably are not at their best. If I'm leading a team or part of a team, I have a responsibility to try and provide an opportunity where people feel as though they belong to this group. They're part of the team. Because when we push somebody outside of the team, gossiping, bullying, whatever it might be, we ostracize somebody, we know the negative impact that has on an individual. Burnout, depression, it could be as well acts of aggression. It gets to that level. That's why that's so important. Listening is the next behavior that we talk about in terms of building a stronger relationship bridge. That is our 4th cable. And I would say listening is like a superpower. That to be able to truly and authentically listen to somebody else is going to provide an environment where it will naturally start to eliminate disruptive behaviors. Listening with our eyes, listening with our ears, listening with our mind, and listening with our heart. And if I'm listening with my eyes, I'm looking for things like body language. I'm trying to listen to somebody based on how they're acting. If I'm listening to words, then I'm listening to the tone of voice, the words that they use, truly trying to listen. If I'm listening with my mind, I'm constantly assessing the conversation for, is what they're saying really what I'm hearing? And I'll give you an example. I was speaking to somebody a few days ago that was talking about a challenge that they were having with their boss. And the question or the challenge came up in terms of the boss, the manager, said to the individual, I'm not going to argue with you about this. Now, I knew both sides of this. The manager's intention to say that was meaning, I'm in your corner. I'm not going to argue with you about this. Like, I'm with you on this. The employee took this to mean when the person said, I'm not going to argue about this with you, was like, this conversation's over. We're not going to talk about this anymore. And you can see those aren't the same things. at all. But how it was interpreted was completely different from how it was meant to be received. That's why listening with our mind can be so important, to really question, is that really what I think that person meant? And listening with empathy is the last part of this, which is trying to listen in a way that we'd want to be listened to. The next one is around empathy by itself, and empathy is so important. Empathy requires a lot of vulnerability for us to be in a place where I'm truly going to try and place myself in your shoes and see things from your perspective. It is one of the strongest behaviors that we can have, and oftentimes gets misinterpreted as weak, when in fact it is the strongest. And the last one of the cable's behaviors is around clear expectations. And when we think about this as it relates to disruptive behaviors, if we have clear expectations around what is acceptable behavior within this team, then we already have a guideline of how we're going to treat each other. Now, the other part of clear expectations or specifics is accountability, is that when people don't behave in ways that are in alignment with what we have said is appropriate behavior, then there needs to be an accountability for that or an ownership for that. And oftentimes that's where this slips, is that there are the bad behaviors and they're ignored, or I hope I don't have to deal with this right now, when in fact we do. We've got to deal with these things because it's the only way that we're going to be able to extinguish disruptive behaviors and the negative impact that they have is by standing together. And this is part of that being a team, that there's a commitment that we all make to each other as a team, that these are sort of the rules of the road that we're going to run by. And when we do that, when we can provide that environment, we almost set a peer pressure for each other to behave in ways that suffocate out disruptive behaviors. That's the only way that this truly happens. Obviously, I've got to do my part, but it can only be done as a team if we're really going to effectively get where we need to go. My hope is that this information that I've given to you in regards to the research around disruptive behaviors and their negative impact, as well as some solutions and behaviors that really create an environment that suffocates out disruptive behaviors, I hope this is helpful. If you know somebody that you think might benefit from this podcast, I'd ask that you forward it on to them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please go ahead and subscribe. And it would mean the world to me if you'd leave a rating or a comment as it relates to this or any other episode that I have, because that's how this message continues to get out there. And I've had some incredible interactions as a result of these in terms of the messages that they've been able to provide for people. And until our next episode, I hope you're able to do two things. One is lead like no other, and the other is rise above your best. Peace.